Okay, so you're tuned in to the deep dive.
Yeah.
And today we're going to do a deep dive on something I'm sure you hear about all the time, tariffs.
Yeah.
And when you hear that word, you probably think like, oh my gosh, so boring, like economics textbooks. But honestly, these seemingly really dry terms that you hear like tariff, they actually have a very tangible effect on what you buy, the choices you see in stores, and even just how you understand the news.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it may seem like kind of a technical term, but I think after this deep dive, you'll understand why they actually do matter in your daily life.
Right.
And so, I mean, the goal of this isn't to get bogged down in any kind of like political debates or anything, but just to kind of demystify like what they are, why they matter. And also, we're going to try to expand your working vocabulary as much as we can. We're going to be looking at tariffs from a bunch of different angles to give you a really clear picture of like how relevant they actually are.
So let's just jump right into it. Like, what is a tariff?
So in the simplest terms, a tariff is just a tax that governments impose on goods that are brought in from another country. So if you think about it, it's basically just a fee that's charged on imports.
Imports meaning when we bring goods in.
Exactly.
So can you give us an example of maybe something that we import very commonly that might have a tariff on it?
Well, you know, you could think about your morning coffee.
Right.
If those coffee beans are grown in Colombia or Brazil or wherever, there's a chance that when they arrived in your country, a tariff was applied.
I see.
The same could be true for the smartphone in your pocket,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe even, the shoes that you're wearing if they were made overseas.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. So it's basically this extra added cost to these items that are coming from another country.
Yeah, exactly.
And that brings us to vocabulary. So we've already said the word tariff a bunch of times, but let's make sure we're all on the same page, like really what that means.
Okay, so tariff is this tax, right? But it's a tax specifically on imported goods. Now, think about the opposite of importing, what would we call that? When a country sells its goods to other nations.
That would be export, right? So the goods are heading out of the country.
Precisely.
Okay.
Import is bringing them in, export is sending them out. Now, where do you think these goods typically get checked and where these tariffs are collected?
That's where customs comes in.
Exactly. So customs refers to the official government agency that's in charge of regulating the flow of goods across international borders. So at a customs checkpoint, that's where imported goods get inspected and any applicable tariffs, which are sometimes called duties, are levied.
I see. Okay.
So to recap our vocab, we have tariff, which is this tax on imports. Imports, meaning bringing goods into a country. Exports, meaning selling goods to other countries.
Yeah.
And then customs, which is that border authority that handles all of these goods and taxes.
All right. So now let's think about how tariffs might impact you directly, as you're going about your day-to-day life.
Okay, well, this is where it actually gets real for a lot of people. So remember that smartphone example we talked about. So if the government decides to impose a tariff on smartphones, the companies importing those phones are going to have to pay an increased cost, right?
Right.
And to maintain their profit margins, oftentimes they will pass on at least part of that cost to the consumer in the form of higher prices.
So the latest iPhone is suddenly a little bit more expensive just because of a tariff.
Exactly.
It's not just sticker shock, though. Could it also affect maybe the variety of things we can actually buy?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So if a tariff is really, really high, it can actually make some imported products too expensive for retailers to even stock them.
Right.
So they may say, well, it's just not profitable anymore for us to carry this olive oil from Italy or these tools from Germany. So that could lead to fewer choices available to you as the consumer.
Right. So not only are the prices maybe going up, but the selection of things that I want could be shrinking.
Exactly.
That's kind of a double whammy.
Yeah, and it can also kind of subtly shift your purchasing habits. If imported goods are suddenly more expensive because of tariffs, you might start considering locally produced alternatives that are now more competitively priced.
Oh, interesting.
So in a way, tariffs can kind of unintentionally support the consumption of domestic goods.
Right. So it creates a kind of artificial advantage maybe for local producers. How could you say that? The impacts
Yeah.
in kind of a clear, everyday English sentence.
Oh, well, you could say something like, Due to the new tariff on imported clothing, domestically manufactured shirts became a more budget-friendly option for many shoppers.
Okay, I like that. So you use the word tariff,
Yeah.
and then you implied, the impact on consumer choice.
Right.
That's great. So let's move on to how tariffs land on businesses. I mean, they're the ones that are doing the importing, exporting, so they must feel it, right?
Absolutely. I mean, businesses are on the front lines of this. So imagine you have a company that makes toys in, let's say, Vietnam, but they sell most of those toys in the U.S. If the U.S. suddenly imposes a tariff on imported toys, that company is kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Right, because do they absorb the cost of the tariff themselves and eat into their profits?
Yeah.
Or do they raise the price of their toys?
Exactly. And if they raise the price of their toys, they risk losing customers to competitors that might be based in countries with lower tariffs, or maybe companies that are producing the toys locally in the U.S. already.
Right.
So, tariffs can really impact a company's ability to compete internationally.
So what are some of the ways that they kind of combat that? What are some of the strategies that these businesses might take if they are faced with these tariff barriers?
One common thing that we see is companies reevaluating their supply chains.
Okay.
So they might consider moving their manufacturing operations to countries that have more favorable trade agreements
Okay.
with their target markets. And that way they can either avoid tariffs altogether or at least reduce them. Another tactic is to try to source more of their components and raw materials from within the country where they sell their products, again, to lessen their reliance on those imports that are being taxed.
Right, so they could try to move their factories or find new suppliers. But that sounds like a really big change. It's not like a decision that you would make lightly.
Oh, no, absolutely not. It's a huge undertaking, so there are other less drastic measures that businesses could take.
Okay.
For example, they could just adjust their pricing strategy a little bit. They might try to strike a balance between covering the added costs from the tariff, but also, staying competitive.
Right.
And then you have other businesses that decide to focus on maybe very specialized or niche products where they have a really unique value proposition that allows them to either absorb that tariff themselves or pass it on to customers that are maybe willing to pay a premium.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so there are a lot of different strategies that businesses might employ depending on the situation.
It's interesting how much one little tariff could impact the whole business strategy. So let's look now at some global examples. Keeping in mind we're just observing, not taking sides, just looking at how tariffs work around the world.
Okay, so let's look at Taiwan, for example. They're a really significant player in the global technology supply chain.
Right.
They export a huge range of things, from semiconductors to bicycles.
Mm-hmm.
And when other countries impose tariffs on these exports from Taiwan, it can really influence the competitiveness of their industries.
I see.
But on the flip side, if there are favorable tariff arrangements through trade agreements, that can give a huge boost to Taiwan's export sector.
So it's a double-edged sword. It can really be an advantage or a disadvantage depending on, the trade relationships that are in place.
Exactly. Now, let's take a look at the relationship between the European Union and the United States. We've seen times where the EU has applied tariffs to some American products, like agricultural goods or steel, and the U.S., in response, has imposed tariffs on European goods like wine or cheese. So this kind of back and forth shows how tariffs can be used in a reciprocal way.
Right. Those are the ones that we see in the news. And it shows how big of an impact they can have because it's not, just impacting small countries. It's impacting these big trade partners as well.
Absolutely. Now, another really interesting trend is the rise of manufacturing in a lot of Southeast Asian countries. And to a certain extent, this shift has been driven by companies that are trying to diversify their production locations. They want to spread out where they're making their goods. And part of the motivation behind that is potentially to avoid or reduce the impacts of tariffs that are imposed, between other major economic blocs.
Wow. So tariffs can even play a role in, where companies are putting their factories and how the whole map of manufacturing globally is changing.
Absolutely.
It's a lot more than just this one simple tax. Okay, so let's come back to English and look at some more specific vocabulary terms that are related to tariffs that you might encounter, as you're reading or listening to the news. So we've talked about tariff and duty, and you mentioned that they're sometimes used interchangeably. So what about this term import duty?
Yeah, import duty is pretty self-explanatory.
Right, a duty on your imports.
Exactly. So it's basically just another common term for tariff. It refers specifically to the tax that a customs authority levies on goods entering the country. So whether you see tariff or import duty, they're basically referring to the same thing.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about the term trade war? That sounds a little bit more serious.
Yeah, so a trade war describes a situation where two or more countries are engaged in a sustained pattern of imposing tariffs and other trade barriers on each other's goods. It's like a tit for tat. One country will impose a tariff, the other country will retaliate, and it just creates this ongoing conflict in international trade policy.
Hmm.
So the term itself can sound a little bit dramatic, but really it just signifies this conflict that's happening between countries.
Right, and we're just focusing on the definition, not like the politics of it all.
Right.
So our last vocab word for this segment is supply chain,
Okay, yeah.
which we hear all the time these days. So what exactly does that mean?
So supply chain basically encompasses the entire process of bringing a product from its raw material stage all the way to the end consumer.
Oh, wow. So that's everything.
It's everything. So it includes, sourcing the components, manufacturing, transportation, warehousing, distribution, everything. And tariffs can actually inject costs and complexities at many different points along the supply chain, which means, potentially higher prices for consumers or disruptions in the flow of goods.
So like a tariff on one specific component that goes into a product that could affect the whole journey of the product and how much it costs at the end.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. Um, could you give us some example sentences using some of these terms?
Sure. So you might read a news report that says the government imposed a 20% import duty on steel.
Okay.
Or in a business context, you might hear disruptions in the global supply chain due to new tariffs are forcing manufacturers to look for alternative suppliers.
Okay, so those are good practical examples of how you might actually see them used. And it's really helpful, I think, to see them in a sentence and not just, the word by itself.
Mhm.
So we talked earlier about Taiwan and, given that it's such a major player in global trade, let's talk about how tariffs can affect their economy, specifically.
Right. So, as we've mentioned, Taiwan is a major exporting nation. So, when other countries lower or eliminate tariffs on goods coming from Taiwan, it tends to create a really good environment for their businesses
Right.
because, it makes their products more competitive on price,
Right, of course.
which means more exports, which means more revenue coming in, and ultimately it can boost their economic growth.
So lower tariffs can really be a good thing for their economy.
It can be a huge advantage.
So what happens on the other side when tariffs on those Taiwanese goods increase?
Well, then things get a bit more challenging for Taiwanese businesses because now their products are suddenly more expensive for buyers in those countries. And if they're more expensive, people might buy less, which could lead to a decline in demand, a decrease in those export revenues, and it can really impact the profitability of a lot of Taiwan's key industries. Businesses might start to struggle to maintain their market share, if their goods are just not as price competitive anymore.
Right, so it's a direct link. What happens with international trade policy can really affect how well Taiwanese businesses are able to do.
Right.
How does this work with smaller businesses in Taiwan, like those that are selling their products maybe online, or maybe it's like a small boutique brand? How are they affected?
Yeah, so for smaller businesses, especially those that are hoping to sell their goods internationally, understanding all of these tariff rules is absolutely critical.
Of course.
They need to do their research. They need to look into the import duties that apply to their specific products in the countries where they're hoping to sell.
Right.
That's going to determine how they price their products, which markets they should focus on, even whether it makes sense to export certain goods at all.
Wow, so that's huge.
Yeah. For them, knowing about these costs and these regulations can really make a big difference between, success and failure in the global market.
So whether you're like a huge semiconductor manufacturer or a small business selling artisan food products, tariffs are something that you really need to pay attention to and know how to work with.
Absolutely. Tariffs are often talked about on this, really big macroeconomic level, but they also have a very real impact on individual companies, big and small. And ultimately, they do affect the consumer because they can affect the prices that we pay for goods.
Right, absolutely. So next time you're online shopping or maybe reading a news article about trade, hopefully you'll have a better understanding of, the role that tariffs play in all of it, how those goods are moving around the world, and ultimately how they affect what you pay at the checkout.
And hopefully now you'll have a better grasp on some of the vocab related to tariffs and international trade as well.
Yes, exactly. So here's a thought for you to consider. How could understanding global trade terms, like tariff, help you become not just a smarter consumer, but also someone who can really grasp the interconnectedness of our global economy? What other economic concepts that maybe seem complicated on the surface might have a surprisingly big impact on your daily life? That's something for you to think about.
Yeah, it's worth pondering.
Thanks for joining
Thanks
us.
for having me.